Right, I think we will start. Just stand here. It's all the nice things. So thank you very much for coming tonight to Hamid's book launch. And for those of you who don't know him, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hamid Keshmirshekan, who I've known for many years. In fact, met him when he just arrived, really, I think, in England. So Hamid, of course, is research associate at Columbia University and also was senior teaching fellow at the Department of Art and Archaeology at SOAS. Before arriving in England, of course, he lectured extensively on art at the Iranian Academy of Arts in Iran. He has published widely on Middle Eastern art and Iranian art, and he's also given many, many talks on the subject. So tonight, he's here to talk about his new book, which is on sale tonight at a very special discount price. So please do have a look at it and ask him to sign it. The title of which is on the screen, The Art of Iran in the 20th and 21st Century. And I must say, I've had a look at it, and it provides an extremely interesting discourse, in one part challenging the assumption that's been made by many Western art historians of Islamic art, that Islamic art ends in the 19th century. So I'm going to hand over to you to take over and tell us all about your book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your very kind introduction, Alison, and also to the Royal Asiatic Society for providing this opportunity to talk about my book today, and also in particular Matty for his time and assistance during this time. A few words about the book and its approach before we go through the slides. This book serves as a complement to my earlier monograph, Contemporary Iranian Art, New Perspectives, published in 2013, and extend the scholarly inquiry, although in a rather different format. While the previous work primarily constituted a historical examination of Iranian art form, art from the late 19th century to the early 2000s, this book shifts its focus to discourses and their influence on art movements and practices during the 20th and 21st centuries. Rather than aiming for a comprehensive survey, its intention is to selectively explore debates that were relevant during this period. Grounded in a social art historical framework, the central hypothesis guiding this book posits that the discourses contributing to artistic paradigms in this era are deeply intertwined with the contextual circumstances in which these works were produced. I explore these underlying themes and discourses and discussions through a series of case studies involving a close examination of the works of various artists. Given the existence of parallels in contemporary, but more importantly, particularly in modern art practices and discourses in Iran and the wider MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, throughout the chapters, I have sought to highlight some of these counterparts. Occasionally, I have included brief comparative accounts and parallels, making reference to regional perspectives and practices, particularly those from the Arab world. As we can see in the contents, these topics are examined throughout 3 parts and 9 chapters, with each chapter addressing specific themes and discourses. So as we can see, the book consists of 3 main parts. The first part, defining the framework and developing conceptual definitions. which is theorizing the whole concept of the book and the meanings of modern and contemporary art in Iran. The second part, discourses on modern and contemporary art, which consists of 3 chapters, and also the last part, art practices and sociocultural discourses. The first part, defining the framework. In this particular section, chapters deal with the question of the discipline's scope and framework and articulates the key concept around which this book is centered. That is the question of definitions of modern and contemporary art of Iran. Both by conceptual and historiographical examination of modern and contemporary art in Iran, these chapters try to theorize the concepts through an alternative art historical account. In line with decolonizing canonical art history, in chapter 1, challenging points of entry, theorizing modern and contemporary art of Iran, I have tried to critically examine artistic encounters with the modern and the contemporary in Iran and define alternative conceptual and temporal perspectives, which in some way counter the Eurocentric and historicist readings of these terms and concepts. My aim in this chapter in particular is to re-evaluate the prevailing historiographical questions surrounding the study of art of Iran in the 20th and 21st centuries, including its potential association and disassociation with the classical discipline of Islamic art history and contemporary global art history. Despite recent transnational approaches, it appears that the divide between these 2 perspectives remains relevant, rooted in a framework shaped by the concept of civilization, as opposed to one predominantly based on modern nation states. One of the key challenges encountered in the study of art of Iran lies in the historiographical and methodological disparities between art history of Persia and the global paradigms of modern and contemporary art history with their distinct temporal orientations. Also, the classical Eurocentric models of art history writing tend to follow a worldview derived from a linear history, often failing to establish or adapt art historical models to accommodate different temporalities and contexts. As we will see in this book, the terms modern and contemporary do not always serve the creation of a temporal and terminological synchronicity with Western art history. I examine how these terms should be situated within the context of art historical discourse, particularly in relation to their conceptual and historical definitions in the Iranian context. Throughout the book, and specifically in this chapter, I aim to trace the genealogies of modern and contemporary art movement in Iran, framing them within the context of Iranian cultural history. I argue that the conceptualization and periodization, especially in the case of contemporary art, should not be solely based on stylistic or artistic considerations, aesthetic considerations. Rather than that, it should be rooted in the conceptualization of the discursive systems that are complexly connected to the specific context of Iran. The second chapter on historiography of modern and contemporary art of Iran selectively discusses the various elements of each art historical narratives in different primary sources, including articles, critical reviews, exhibition catalogs, and books written by artists, critics, and art historians, both in Persian and English, with just 2 exceptions written in German and French that I've examined briefly. from the 1940s to the 2010s and examine their ideological premises, sources, and discourses, the historical models they are based on, the temporal perspective, as well as the linguistic and technological choices. I show how negotiating culture and political associations, debates on common encounters with modernism, discussions about values of modern and contemporary artistic practice, questions of authenticity, the constant fluctuation between past and present, and the attribution to the nature of Iranian culture reflected in those primary sources. Arranged in chronological order, beginning with the 1945 text, for example, the magazine Payam No, and also Who's Jangi or Fighting Rooster magazine, and ending with the books in the 2020s. I examine these developments in order to understand how modern and contemporary art in Iran have been perceived over time and how these perceptions are shaped by various ideological and conceptual perspectives. For example, while facing the problem of tracing a coherent definition and formulation of modern art, or in Persian, Hunar No, and contemporary art, Hunar Muasir, or an articulate art historical narrative of the development of Iranian art through writings in Persian periodicals alone is inevitable. These texts reveal how social political spirits of the time affected art and artistic engagements. The second part of the book, Discourses on Modern and Contemporary Art, traces the dominant discourses of modern and contemporary art practices by Iranian artists from the 1940s to the present time. Chapter 3, which is perhaps one of the longest chapters of this book, is on the discourse of new traditionalism, reflecting the past into the present. And it centers on the 1960s and 1970s and scrutinizes the notion of Iranian modernism by exploring the concept of new traditionalism and its expression in art practices, with a specific focus on the Saqakhane movement, the most important tendency within the Iranian art history in the 20th century. Here, Euro-American modern art methods were considered essential, but not entirely sufficient for the development of this art discourse. The main aim of this approach, similarly practiced in many non-Western worlds and particularly in the MENA region, was to reflect a modified version of modernity integrated into other cultural facets of Iranian society during the period. I talk about other aspects of this movement in this chapter and try to examine how this notion was realized within the context of Iran's mid-20th century sociocultural practices. The crucial debates over the creation of a balance between the two opposing forces of modernism and cultural authenticity, which had been ongoing since earlier decades, reached to a peak in the 1960s and led to the emergence of the highly acclaimed new traditionalist movement known as the Saqakhane tendency. The Saqakhane in the 1960s, with its diverse expressions, was essentially born within a cultural and political environment where questions regarding collective national identity and the revival of authentic cultural heritage were predominant concerns. In addition to historical facts, I also examine other factors that might have contributed to the formation and promotion of this movement. These include the influence of official culture, mainly governed by the Ministry of Culture and Arts, and also later Secretary of Queen Farah Pahlavi during the Pahlavi period and this particular time. exemplified through the Tehran Biennales from 1958 to 1966 and the Shiraz Arts Festivals, as well as our market interests. So overall in this chapter, I try to revisit and revise all the writings, primary sources, articles written on the subject, including my own writings, earlier writings, from a critical point of view, and somehow revise all those historical and conceptual errors that had happened while dealing with this topic. For example, I don't use the term school anymore, or even movement. I would prefer to use the term tendency or trend rather than that. Starting from Charles Hussein's and Deroudi's Who is this Hussein? The World is Crazy About, the iconic work created in 1958, and concluding with the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Arts exhibition of a group of these artists who we know as Sakakhan artists in 1977, I further scrutinized the aesthetic elements of works and artists closely associated with the tendency, both for their artistic viewpoints and the visual characteristics. Through different approaches, artists of the Sakakhan movement drew inspiration from cults, rituals, and products of folk culture. Various abstract forms, and of course later figurative forms, were created in which the ornamental elements and geometrical shapes drawn from different sources of folk art, metalwork, historical architecture, and calligraphy were juxtaposed throughout the whole canvas or sculpture, typically in symmetrical constructions. And these are a few images related to the movement and historical facts and how they are, or they were supposed to be related to this movement by an art critic, Karim Emami, who just coined this term for this tendency. I mean, the literary Sakakhaneh, mainly taken in the mid-20th century in Iran, both exterior and interior, and its conceptual meanings and even formal characteristics and how they are related to the materials, what the artists call the raw materials they use for inspiration, mainly material culture related to the Shiite vernacular material culture. For those who are familiar with these elements, it's quite obvious how they are related, at least as a part of initial approaches by these artists in the early 1960s. And also the artists who mainly are affiliated to this movement, artists such as Charles Hussein Zenderoudi in the left, and also Parviz Tanawari on the right, the sculptor, the pioneer of Iranian modern sculpture actually, and also the others who have been included in different writings as somehow members of this movement, which I believe was not quite accurate, but they include artists such as from the left, Faramaz Pilaram, in the middle, Masoud Arabshahi, and on the right, Mansour Qandriz, and also others in figurative, perhaps, approach towards those materials, such as from the left, Jazeh Tabatabai, in the middle, Nasser Owaisi, and on the right, Sadegh Tabrizi. I've also talked about other parallels and examples which were not affiliated to this movement, but similarly approached those materials and also concerns, such as Siyar Majani, especially in the late 1950s works before he left Iran to the US, and also post-Saqaqani movements such as calligraphic painting approaches or tendency, Naqashi Khat, works of Muhammad Ihsai. I also touch upon a few other examples in the Arab world which similarly approached traditional heritage and also at the same time were involved in modernism, such as from the left, Iraqi artists, influential artists, Jawad Salim, and then after Moroccan artist Mohammed Ataullah, a member of Casablanca group, and also later, and the other one after, Diyal al-Zawi, Iraqi artist, and on the right, Umar al-Najdi using calligraphic or textual elements in his works, almost more or less at the same time. In this chapter also, I talk about other more alternative collectives and movements. I talk about the two main movements, including Talar Iran in the 1960s, or Iran's whole, and also the independent group of painters and sculptors, or in Persian, Gruh Azad Naqashan va Mujassam Sazan. So during the 1960s, two important artistic collectives grappled with the establishment of alternative modern art movements in Iran. So they were both involved in that complex, argument. Experimental in nature, in particular, the Azad group, the second one in the 1970s, experimental in nature, their main objective was to challenge the art scene in Tehran, responding to the rise of market-oriented modern art practices exhibited in the growing commercial galleries. Their commitment lay in fostering innovation within art, often employing unconventional materials and media, including performances and installations. So these were somehow the initial approaches towards what we can now call it contemporary art in the 1970s. The works in this slide from the left by iconic figure of modern Iranian art, Marco Grigorian, and in the middle, an installation by Mortaza Momayez, and on the right, another installation, element of urban art by Ghulam Hossein Nami, and on the top is a cover of one of their exhibitions. The next chapter discourses on post-revolutionary art, the 1980s and early 1990s, which itself is divided into two parts, early years, early decades of post-revolutionary period, and also the second decade after the revolution. I talk about how the revolution brought a sudden end to the official culture of the Pahlavi era and everything associated with it, including all those movements and practices, art practices that we just discussed. It was replaced by revolutionary art that championed the new values of the newly established Islamic Republic. The concept of modernism was perceived as a threat to the religious-centric belief system of the Islamic worldview. The profound changes that occurred in various aspects of Iranian life, including politics and culture, following the revolution had a significant impact on the development of post-revolutionary art. This situation effectively halted the growth of modern art movements in Iran and perhaps contemporary arts as a part of a deliberate, enduring effort to create visual propaganda. Governmental agencies, organizations, and various cultural groups used the visual arts as a means to promote, disseminate, and solidify the objectives of the Islamic Republic. These works were not really related directly to the official revolutionary art after the revolution, but just in the book, I've just included These works, which were mainly related to another alternative movement before the revolution, mainly created based on socialist beliefs and also third worldist and revolutionary aspirations rather than just Islamic. For example, the genre social documentary or documentary photography taken by a group of artists or photographers, such as Maryam Zandi, that you can see on the left, and on the right, Bahman Jalali, and also the bottom row, painting by important figure in Iranian modern art, Hannibal al-Khas, as we can see, is more third worldist, anti-imperialist rather than religious or Islamic. And also another poster by Kurosh Shishigaran on the right. So all of these, or even not all, and most of them at least, the lower parts, I mean, artists in that part, somehow faded from the scene after the revolution. But it soon became apparent that the artists of the revolution, there was a title that was given to these artists, received formal support from cultural authorities, and their works were predominantly displayed in public spaces through various formats like posters and murals in particular. Within the sociocultural context of newly established Islamic Republic, concept known as mutahed or committed art emerged, signifying art that was dedicated to revolutionary ideas and sponsored by the Artistic Center of Islamic Propaganda Organization, in Persian, Hawze Hunari Sazman Tabligat Islami. Throughout the 1980s, these artists occupied exhibition halls, civic institutions, and public spaces, notably the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which was repurposed now as a grand gallery space for public exhibitions, with exhibiting large-scale propaganda paintings and posters. These exhibitions also encompass a range of traditional arts later, including calligraphy and miniature paintings, which was then referred to as Irano-Islamic Negargari, as a newly created term, as an alternative to terms such as miniature painting or Persian painting that was supposed to be a kind of Western European terminology that needed to be revisited. Prominent among these creations were politically charged public murals that conveyed a profound commitment to revolutionary values. These murals commemorated revolutionary struggles and honored war heroes, often covering the main walls of the cities to mobilize viewers during the war, as we can see in this image. So these are all committed artists or revolutionary artists. Examples from the left, a painting by Habibullah Sadeghi, in the middle, another painting by Kazim Chalipa, and on the right, a mural by an unknown artist. So the second part of this chapter is about the second phase of post-revolutionary period. The conclusion of the war signaled the beginning of the second phase of post-revolutionary art and culture, which engaged in a dialogue with modernity. In the terminology of the Islamic Republic, this period corresponding to Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani's presidency from 1989 to 1997 was referred to as the reconstruction, or in Persian, Sazandagi period. During this time, the concept of national identity was reflected in art that was informed by both national Islamic characteristics and modernist paradigms. Gradually, beginning in the late 1980s and increasingly during the 1990s, the new trends emerged including the resurgence of post-revolutionary modernism. And these are a few examples created by more established artists in this period. And apart from these artists, there were a great group of younger artists who joined this movement by creating modernistic works, but at the same time inspired by so-called cultural heritage or traditional forms. From the left, the painting by Nusratullah Muslimian, in the middle, a work by Ali Reza Espahbod, established modernist, and also on the right, a painting by Jafar Rubakhsh. As we can see in his work, there are stylistic or aesthetic similarities to the works of early period of Saqakhane, such as Zendirudi. The fifth chapter, the paradigms of contemporary art. So, it's a main focus on the concept of contemporary art from now. It explores the concepts, mechanisms, and the strategies, and also paradigms of our practices in Iran in that particular period, aiming to establish connections between these paradigms and the burgeoning contemporary art practice in Iran during the 2000s. By the 1990s, it became increasingly evident that Iranian art was undergoing a gradual transformation, moving away from the frame of the recently developed post-revolutionary artistic modernism and beginning to incorporate new perspectives that engaged with existing realities. This is the key point here that I believe is somehow would distinguish between these practices and the earlier ones, modernist ones, which main concern was formal aspects rather than concepts and contents of the works. The third phase of post-revolutionary art and cultural practices began with the so-called reformism from 1997 to 2005, during which new movements and discourses began to flourish within Iranian art. The term conceptual art was exactly the term that was used for the first official exhibition held at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art in 2001, which exhibited the works of unconventional, artists whose works suggested unconventional materials and media. So the term conceptual art initially signified a rejection of traditional artistic mediums such as painting or sculpture in favor of various new media such as video, so-called art photography, performances, installations, etc. The shift was characterized not only by the keenness to employ unconventional media, but also later by artists' special focus on ideas within their art. So that is something which was very important at that period. Before I continue, I just need to mention briefly that there were a few fragmental practices during the 1990s, earlier than this official establishment of this movement, supported mainly by the Museum of Contemporary Art, that were quite independent. Among others, perhaps the most important one was the Contemporary Art Workshop, was the title that they used for the group, in Persian, Kargah Azad Hunar Muasir, and their practices, in particular, two of them, Project 92, executed in 1992, and also another one in 1998, both executed within a kind of ephemeral spaces that were supposed to be demolished after their execution. So these were somehow contemporary art practices before this establishment formally in 2001. New art, or هنر جدید in Persian, emerged because another title was given to these kinds of conceptual art practices as a distinct trend initially sponsored by institutions, mainly the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, during the 2000s. This movement was predominantly associated with the third generation of artists, a dynamic group of young artists who increasingly embraced new forms of media in their practices. So there are just a few examples of these early works practiced by artists and also exhibited in the official venues such as Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. From the left, an environmental project by Ahmad Nadalian, and is a photo taken from his work, and on the right-hand side is an installation by Morteza Daryabawi. So the second part of this chapter somehow is talking about critical ideas about those earlier movements, basically because of the extreme excitement of those artists with the use of new media, and that would signal just the work to be contemporary. So these artists were critical of those earlier ones and examples. And so gradually many artists from the younger generation started to shift their focus away from seeking the concept of contemporaneity solely within time or age. Instead, they approached it by representing their own work, even if similar issues or subjects had already been explored and resolved elsewhere. So that was not really a question anymore. What fundamentally set apart the diverse contemporary approaches from the concerns of modern art practices was their exploration of the ontology of the present and the question of what it means to exist within the context of contemporaneity or presentness. The most exemplary works in this category were considered contemporary art, not solely because of their use of new media, but because they grapple with some of the most critical personal, social, and political issues of their time. And there are a few examples of the book and these works here, and an installation by the left, Ghazale Hidayat, and also a work by on the right, Farshid Azarang. A few other examples from the left, Mehran Mohajer's photography, and also in the middle, Jinus Tarizode's project, and on the right, Rosita Sharaf Jahan's recent projects. The third part of the book, Art Practices and Sociocultural Discourses, examines art practices and its sociocultural implications thematically through chapters that address various aspects, including the politics of art practice in Iran, the complexities of cultural essentialism and exoticism concerning the global art scene, and the recent focus of market demands and artistic strategies employed to challenge cultural stereotypes. In chapter 9, the politics of art practice in contemporary Iran examines how individual artists develop their own artistic strategies that are relevant to the demands of contemporaneity. Focusing on the period from 2005 onward, the end of reform period, coinciding with the resurgence of fundamentalism in the political culture of the Islamic Republic, the official support for new art faded. Consequently, a new wave of more autonomous contemporary art emerged within the private sector and artists' personal networks. I discussed the development of private art sector within the country in particular, and the art market, both regionally and nationally, during this period, and their roles in shaping specific trends and genres within the art world. I argue that the market system has cultivated certain stereotypical perspectives among value arbiters by imposing its own standards. Consequently, there has been an effort to redirect this discourse, including a rejection of the notion of art as an industry in itself and the ideological formulations surrounding a work of art. Through an examination of the works of a number of socioculturally, politically engaged art practices, I delve into how artistic engagement with activism is increasingly moving beyond prescribed agendas and adopting more nuanced approach. There are examples that I've examined in this chapter, including the work by Barbad Gorshiri, an installation, majestic installation from his curriculum matrix series, and also others, installation from the left, Mahmoud Bakhshi, and also in the middle, Nazgul Ansarinia, and another interactive installation by Nedar Razavipur on the right. Fortunately, we don't have time to talk about these works. The main core of chapter 7, artists attempt to reclaim cultural space versus the state's cultural prescriptions, is that artists have not been observed by the state's soft power, which aims to impose its political and ideological values on the nation's life. I talk about various facets of identity politics and their association with the cultural strategies of the post-revolutionary state. I also explore how artists engage in aesthetic resistance against the state's directives, particularly as formulated through the Ministry of Culture and Islamic guidance, with a primary focus on the concept of constructed collective identity. Instead of internalizing the demands of the dominant ideology or mainstream, or conforming to the subject's passive stance against power, as Michel Foucault has already argued, artists as social subjects can actively counter the dominant ideology. I then argue that the highly centralized and ideological nature of the Islamic Republic necessitates that any alternative response inherently possesses a political cultural essence. I examine a multifaceted strategies employed by artists in opposition to these formulated frameworks. In the book, I talk about these examples, more than these, but I mean, these are some examples. On the left, performance by Amir Mobed, on the right, photographic project by Aham Taghiov, and from the left again, painting series by Behnam Samadzadegan, and on the right, stage photographic series by Azadeh Akhlaqi. And the 8th chapter, exhibiting essentialism, exoticism, and its attendant uniformity, provides a critical account of the challenges related to reception and the politics of representation within the international, mainly Euro-American exhibition system. Drawing on Timothy Mitchell's concept of the exhibitionary order, in which he talks about Western portrayals of the non-West during the 19th century, in particular, through the world exhibitions, and talk about the three main elements, which was the main elements or mechanism by those exhibitions, including essentialism, otherness, and absence. I also examined the works of contemporary artists from Iran in relation to the stereotypes perpetuated by Orientalist and New Orientalist practices. I contend that the primary objective of many of these international exhibitions is to present essentialized cultural perspectives and a fixed image of ethnicity, which often reduces the artistic creations of these artists to geopolitical and or ethnic concepts. This issue is complexly linked to the politics of visuality as it is the exhibition system itself that establishes the standards for visibility and representation. I talk about critical artistic practices and the discursive strategies employed to challenge the standardization and essentialization of art from Iran. These critical artists aspire for their works to serve as a means of offering historical and social commentary, often drawing from their personal experiences and explorations. These artists deliberately engage in negotiations, criticisms, and also deconstructions of the concept of otherness by emphasizing self-criticism, re-examinations of the past, and active sociopolitical engagement within their works. I have borrowed the concept of strategic exoticism from Graham Hogan, where he's talking about how our literary figures and authors, writers use this strategy to attack exoticism, which involves operating within the codes of exoticist representation. I talk about the strategy or this strategy that can either subvert those codes or effectively repurpose them to reveal and explore differential power relations. And these are some examples of these works from the right, an installation by Shahab Futuhi, in the middle, sculpture or installation by Shapur Puyan, and on the left, work by Borbat Burshiri. Finally, the 9th chapter, humorous art practices, a strategic response to stereotyping, is actually a complement to the earlier chapters, and in particular, continuation of the last 2 chapters, and in which I focus on the strategies employed by artists, whether living within or outside the country, to counteract those forces, mainly international exhibition systems and also ideological prescriptions by the domestic authorities, particularly by using the language of humor, irony, and satire. I contend that the development of irony and the addressing of contradictions through humorous subversion of cultural norms and standardization are pivotal strategies within artistic practices in Iran. Here, art serves as an agent of critique against the prevailing status quo, self-exoticism, or categorizations that are solely constructed based on foreign values or formulated by domestic authorities. And there are, I've just included 3 examples of these works in this slide. From the left, the Carpet Project by Nazgul Ansarinia, and in the middle, a work from Super Sohrab series by Sohrab Kashani, and on the right, a calligraphic, textual sculpture by Iman Safai. Through their resistance to agendas that perpetuate objectification and exoticism, artists demonstrate their self-awareness regarding their subject position, which is the most important aspect of these works. And the last sentence or the last statement, which is not quite optimistic, but perhaps I believe it is the case, while the deliberate and self-conscious use of exoticist techniques, and models of cultural representation can be seen as a response to the issue of post-colonial awareness, sadly, it does not inherently provide a solution to the dilemma. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Emily, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. You're trying to move away from using school or movement. I think particularly, but not solely, to do with the Sarikani group, from a group. Would you just expand on that more? And because in my mind, I'm trying to remember what you told me many, many years ago about that group. And in my mind, it was quite a conscious, artist-led concept or movement. But was that term and that grouping more of a art historical kind of imposing it on them? But yeah, I'd love to know more about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. Yes, I already used, like many others who have written on this subject, used the term school because the main person, the first person who used, who created this term, Sakakane, used the term school. And I went through all his writings and his writings in particular. I found it quite interesting, but at the same time quite puzzling because, I realized that he was not quite consistent even in terms of defining who belongs or affiliated to this movement, or even somehow he contradicts his writings, earlier writings in the later writings. So I came to understand that, all these presumptions that follow somehow something that, initially and perhaps from the beginning had some problems, so needs to be revisited. So, for example, they included some artists who had no affinity even for the definition of, his own definition of what is Sakakane art. So, and apart from that, the historical fact would really support my idea that there was no whatsoever connection, real connection between members of, they were not really members, but these figures who were working quite separately. And some of them had some kinds of friendship through their lives. For example, Hamid and Charlie Rudy, for about a year or so, they were working together. And a few others were classmates at the College of Decorative Arts as students. But there was no chance, for them to gather together and talk about their ideas, like what is we know about schools when they are talking about something actually quite collectively and decide, or there was no manifesto. For example, in other parallel groups in the Arab world, we have manifestos, we have groups of artists who are talking about particular aims and objectives, and also they have exhibitions, manifestos, etc. And the other interesting point about that I found about this particular genre that I prefer to call it is that they were not homogeneous, they were quite heterogeneous. And so when we look quite carefully at the productions, we realize, and some of them, especially throughout the years, the term Sakakane was used with no particular purpose. And nowadays, many people are using this term without knowing what it really means. One interesting discovery that I really achieved and just have written in this book is that those so-called members of this group were were not really members before the exhibition of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art in 1977. About 15 years after the term was coined, and I was told by the curator of the exhibition a few years ago that in that time, when the museum opened in 1976, and that was the second exhibition of the museum, they were thinking about having an important exhibition, and so they came to the conclusion that that would be a good idea to have a group of artists called Sabakhane artists. And then they selected, the curators selected 8 figures. And now everybody thinks that they were really from the beginning, these 8 people, members of the school. So these are all historical facts that would really criticize what we written about this movement.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture. I had a question about the role of the galleries in the evolution of the Iranian arts. Could you talk a bit about this?
Sure. I mean, this is a big question, actually. I'm not sure before the revolution, after the revolution, during recent years, what particular time exactly?
I was thinking about it now.
Oh, recent. Okay.
And since the beginning of the century.
Beginning of the.
Over the past 25 years.
I couldn't hear you.
Over the past 25 years.
Past 25 years. All right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, during the war, all the galleries had to be closed. I mean, they gradually started to open from late 1980s. So there were not very many, but gradually, in particular during the revolt period, there were a great number of galleries which were added to this kind of service. So in Tehran, as far as I'm concerned, apart from, I mean, and a few other main cities in Iran, and most of the galleries, if not all, are commercial galleries. So the course they are active, but they are commercial galleries, non-profit galleries, like what we know in Europe and perhaps in America. So the main topic is somehow related to the market as well, but in particular during the early 2000s, that the great number of galleries were added to the circle. There were commercial galleries who were acting as non-profit galleries as well. So exhibiting works of unconventional materials and media such as installations, videos, because these works cannot sell. So it's not really something that commercial galleries would like to do. So they had to play a role as a kind of non-profit art spaces. And there were a few non-profit, mainly artist directed places or platforms who acted as platforms for especially the younger generation to exhibit their works, because, as I said, most of these so-called contemporary art practices cannot sell. So they need some kinds of support rather than just, market-oriented support, like, for example, paintings, sculptures, or even photography could sell. But I mean, these works cannot sell, or even, for example, an environmental project or participatory projects. These are all somehow should be non-profit rather than. So that sort of, they cannot be commodified in other way. So I believe during recent years, a wave of market-oriented has overshadowed galleries in Iran as well. So what we can see, namely, exhibitions of a lot of paintings that could be sold very well, and there are a great number of collectors recently joined the club, and they would prefer to get something as an investment. So it is a bit, compared to the early years of 2000, it's more market oriented, unfortunately, apart from the few nonprofit platforms. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you. You had a question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks much for the talk. There are two words that you kept repeating. One was the Oriental and ethnicity, ethnic iconic images. The other one is the modernity. You keep referring to modern. And I was wondering if you can clarify how you see the connection you're talking about. It's within that whole idea of, I would say, talking about Orientalism, and a fixed image. And if the Western market and Western culture doesn't let go of it, it will not be free to be what it is. So I see all these iconic images of Shia and Muslim repeated from previous government during Shah Iran, and it keeps repeating now. And it's hard to have the pendulum to understand it, because within that fixed market of the Oriental image, it can't swing between the modern and contemporary. It is fixed within that image of Oriental.
Thank you. Now, I'm not sure when completed, I understood what you meant, but I tried to answer it. But it is interesting if I've understood it correctly, that what you say, because it's quite in line with what I said in my last sentence, that, whatever happens, if artists consciously even want to somehow counter these Orientalist ideas or some kind of ethnic-oriented ideas, and even counter them, even criticize them by using strategic exoticism, because strategic exoticism, in a sense, means artists quite deliberately use the exotic signs, but at the same time they are criticizing the situation to make it reverse, somehow through the use of those elements, as you mentioned. But the actual meaning and concept of these works are against that sort of perceptions. For example, in one of the works by Shahab, he uses some kinds of ceramic works, traditional ceramic works, in his installation. But at the same time, there are other elements in his works, like Lego sculptures or statues, or he added some kind of a kitchen-like contrast between these two to criticize the concept of ethnic marketing in that sense. But from a glance, it sounds that it is again the repetition of the same kinds of reference to those particular known essentialist elements. But at the same time, it is not. And this is the problem right now, that even if they really consciously want to counter that sort of perception, that it is not guaranteed that they will succeed, because this would depend on the perception of the reader or the viewer who will understand that. So that is the problem. So this is what is called Orientalism and Neo-Orientalism, which is still at work within the system. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I just was wondering about the very interesting point that you made at the beginning of your, when I arrived, there was a delay. You talked about the discursive element in your approach, which I find it very interesting. So I wanted to know a little bit more about how this discursive element can help to understand or through this historical study, let's say, the differentiation between contemporary and not contemporary work or modern work is because it's a bit, as you mentioned yourself, so for you, the 2001 exhibition
at the museum, the point from which the contemporary, the term contemporary would be kind of used for the practice that we're looking at, even though before that we have other practices that we call it contemporary. But it is a bit difficult to really put a line, like in terms of the time that we can now call the words contemporary, as you mentioned. But I was wondering how this element of discourses works. Can like have been played in your study when you look at the works, no matter if it happens during 70s or recent works. Is this something that you find an important element like to look at the practice of the contemporary rather than modernist?
Yes, I mean, thank you. Well, I also mentioned, I mean, it depends. I mean, as an art historian, I would think that even if the art practice, I mean, the artist is not fully aware of what he or she is doing, I'm allowed to somehow interpret it and somehow analyze the work and also even decide whether this is a work of contemporary art or modern. Of course, in some cases, it's quite obvious where the artists are talking about or their works would really explain it. I mentioned in the 1970s, there were a number of works that I could call them contemporary art practices by Murtaza Mayes, for example, or Marco Bergoglian. So, I mean, they were not fully aware of what contemporary art would mean in that context. They had seen perhaps examples of the works in the West, in particular, Marco, who was residing in the US for many years. But I mean, in terms of what I would, I mean, I have defined in this book a quite sharp difference between modernism or modern art and contemporary art is somehow its relation to the concept of contemporaneity, as I said. It's not particularly, of course, we have to take into consideration other elements, including new means of media. That was quite clear in the case of Iranian, and that exhibition 2001. And I didn't really say that it started from that point. I also said that started in my teaching material. I usually say that 1990s as the beginning of, I mean, in general, presence of contemporary art in the art scene because of those fragmented practices and also because of the awareness of artists about somehow themes and subjects which were not related to the kind in the approach of modern art. It's not the question of formal issues. It's not the question of form at all. It's a question of contents, it's a question of concept, it's a question of theme, idea. For example, those practices by Group of Contemporary Art Workshop in 1992. I mean, that practice was quite contemporary. So, because it was about the concept of ephemerality. The main concept was that, not the paintings which were painted on the walls of that old building that was about to be demolished. So that is the subject, actually. That is the idea-based art, what we know about contemporary art in general. Although I have tried to put it in the context of Iranian culture and redefine these concepts such as contemporary. But at the same time, as an art historian, I have to take into consideration what had been defined before as contemporary art in art history. So I took some elements and concepts from that definition in particular, but redefined them in that context. For example, what has been said about the early examples of the works exhibited in the museum in the early exhibitions that many of them were quite similar to the early practices in European conceptual art practices. But I mean, yeah, I mean, that might be true. But I mean, we need to redefine, revisit all these criticisms, and this is the same case with modernism, for example. When we talk about modernism or modernity or modern art, we cannot really rely on the exact definitions that has been done in progressing on history. So we need to define, because I mean, this kind of modernism behind all the other aspects of culture and life is not exactly the same. Something that I call it, I mean, based on multiple modernities and the definitions of aspects and elements of modernity within a different culture that would carry some original elements, but at the same time, there are lots of interpretations. So this is what I defined as contemporary art. It's not exactly as those practices before, but it's quite related to the concept of presentness and contemporary, what is going on right now, which is the most important aspect of contemporary that could be redefined in every different context, not just in Europe. So, but I mean, in Iran, I've defined it within that particular context.
I think you just time for one more question.
We have a question from Zoom.
Oh, Zoom, yes, good. Matty, thank you.
Hiya.
Would you like to read it out, please?
Sure. So this is from Anthony Wynn, and he says, from your chronological accounts, it would appear that revolutionary and patriotic wartime art has given way to political caricature. Other than murals, does the government encourage art favorable to itself to counter this movement?
Yeah. Yeah, I am not sure if this is the case, or I mean, it was about caricature. I mean,
Yes, I think you're talking about paintings and drawings.
yeah, I mean, that was always commissioned. That was governmental projects in general. But I think Anthony was asking about if the government or officials would support caricature practices. That I think it was the case. But of course, as far as they were not critical of the status quo and, of course, the authorities or anything offensive to religious beliefs. So other than that, the government has been, I mean, even now is supportive of those kinds of arts which are in line with the ideology of the state. And so in particular, the early years of the revolution, those works were the only works that were allowed to be exhibited either in the different venues, including Museum of Contemporary Art, and also in the walls of the city. I hope that I answered his question, but if I didn't, perhaps later talk about it.
I think we should leave now. You've done your time. Thank you very much. And please remember the book is for sale. So it's there, just go and have a look at it. It's very, very interesting. And there are lots of questions. So please join us for a drink and thank you very much for coming.